During my break, I went back to play Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song, beating it 3 times back to back. After that, I followed it up with my second ever Romancing SaGa 2 playthrough. Between my last bunch of Saga videos and now, I've gotten to appreciate the series a lot better, as it is one that shines across multiple playthroughs for its entries. There are always multiple ways to approach the games, and there are always paths that you end up closing for yourself by choosing characters, allies, and quest outcomes. With so much replayability, it's a good thing that all the major entries are different from each other, so there's always new things to learn and explore. Between now and my previous videos, I now feel like I was still too early in making them compared to what they really offer. So this time I made an effort to not get Paddington Beared and actually do multiple playthroughs of Romancing SaGa 3. Romancing SaGa 3 is a freeform JRPG set in a world on the brink of war. Monsters are appearing more, nations are at each other's throat, and in the middle of tensions rising, abyss gates are opening across the land, and it's up to you to find them and seal them before their evil influence spreads further. But this is not an immediate focus. We end up following the journeys of characters that we pick ourselves as they travel the land and get into smaller adventures before stumbling their way towards the larger problems. I normally open up talking more about the story, but the Romancing SaGa games are more about setting than they are about story. There are characters and backstories, but these aren't dramatic stories that unfold over time. Quests all have their own minor story reflecting the state of the world and the troubles of the people, but don't expect major events, reveals, or character theming outside of a few big moments near the end of the journey. It's a loose experience where you're just taking in the world as it is. Something that's especially well established in small details like the screens of your party members resting at an inn together, which is different each time. The real meat in Romancing SaGa 3 is the content and the freedom in which you can explore it. After you pick your character and experience their introductory sequence, you're let loose on the world. The introduction sequences can be very short, like Katarina's, or long, like Julian's, each giving you a different slice of the setting before the characters go off on their own journey. And more often than not, seeing the small details of different characters can explain a lot about why some things are the way that they are. Things that you're usually left wondering about as someone else. Early on, you're restricted to areas your character knows about, but as you talk to NPCs, you learn about different towns, caves, forests, dungeons, and general places where you can do things. Most major cities offer ship routes that lead you to different parts of the world, and from there you can work on expanding more of the map. Once you've got areas mapped out, you can always quick travel to them on the world map. Like the other Saga games, there's no overworld, just a map where you select towns and dungeons to go to, allowing you to quickly go from one place to another. There is a lot of setup that's front-loaded. The time you spend opening the map is also the time you start recruiting your party members. Besides your main character, you're free to recruit whoever you want, and everyone can use every type of weapon or spell. Obviously, there are proficiencies to keep in mind, and not everyone excels at the same things, but theoretically, you are allowed to build your party however you want, and as you become more familiar with these systems, the more room you'll realize you really have, which is what makes the replay so satisfying. So let's talk combat. Romancing SaGa 3's combat is a lot like the other two Romancing SaGa games I've covered, but as always, there's enough changes to make it its own thing. So let's just take it from the top. Enemy encounters are always visible on the map. In some areas, their sprites turn into shadows when you run, which makes them harder to track behind objects. Once you touch an enemy, you enter a random encounter. If you were running when you got into a combat encounter, you break your formation, and thankfully, formations this time around are no longer as rigid or mysterious as in Romancing SaGa 2. Formations are pretty self-explanatory, focusing on speed, defense, offense, magic, you get the idea. You also start with most major ones unlocked from the start, so you no longer have to talk to an NPC in town in the hopes of a random chance that they'll give you a new one this time. They're still mostly important during boss fights or stronger encounters, but with the 3-row system being removed in favor of a looser positioning system across a wider range of preset formations, they're not as necessary in terms of keeping characters alive as they used to be. And if you don't like a combat encounter for whatever reason, you can always just run away. It's instantaneous, always works outside of boss fights, and is completely free of charge. Good for re-rolling enemy lineups, or maybe retaking that encounter with your previously broken formation intact. Or just running through an area without fighting to get back to safety. The actual combat itself is straightforward. You select your entire team's attacks in one go and then the turn plays out. After every unit in the combat has done their move, it's time for the next turn. Special attacks cost SP to use and spells cost MP, and of course death costs 1 LP. After every combat, everyone is put back to full health and revived from being knocked out. But used up SP, MP, and LP remains gone until you rest at an inn, which is ridiculously cheap in this entry, or if you use a restorative item. As usual, characters who run out of LP die, but with how cheap it is to stay at an inn in this game, it's borderline trivial outside of the larger boss fights who have a tendency to hit downed allies with AoE attacks. As always, you gain new abilities by randomly sparking them in the middle of combat. Or well, I say randomly. There's always systems with them in place, but what unlocks in Romancing SaGa 3 and when felt a lot more consistent than it did in Minstrel Song or Romancing SaGa 2. Maybe it's just bad luck with the other two games, but it feels like there's a higher number of conditionals in the way of weapon mastery, enemy level, and previously learned skills. That makes the sequence in which you tend to learn abilities a bit more straightforward than usual. Not that I'm complaining, you don't need the best of the best abilities to get through most of the games, but they do help. So being able to consistently get the good abilities is a good thing in my book. What is new though, is the way that it handles skills you've already learned. Similar to Romancing SaGa 2, you have a cap of how many abilities your characters can have active with them. But once you've learned a new skill, there's a chance to acquire it after enough use. Once a skill is acquired, it's a bit like having it mastered. You're free to teach this skill to everyone in your party from this point forward. So even if you remove the ability from the character who mastered it, it's now banked and can be relearned whenever you might need it. These rules apply to temporary party members dropped on you during quests too. You can teach them any skills that you've acquired, and in turn, any skills they acquire can be moved over to permanent party members too. This system helped overcome a problem I had in Minstrel Song, where, sure, there are late-game allies that I'd like to recruit, but then I'd have to reinvest in them from scratch to make them learn the weapon skills and proficiencies all over again. In Romancing SaGa 3, you can just have a temporary party member level up a weapon skill to farm out abilities to pass on to their permanent replacements down the line. This is not something that you would think about when playing for the first time, obviously, but with the party members that can only be recruited relatively late compared to the others, this is a great thing to keep in mind during replays. It's a really nice system that lets you play with the limitations and keep control over your party. I really like it. Spells are bought in town from mentors. You can pretty much put any spell school on any character, and their proficiency and mana pool increases the more spells you cast with them. Though, of course, there are limitations to how good some characters can be at casting spells in general, so characters focusing on magic still have a real purpose in the game, rather than everyone essentially being a combat mage. One nice thing about full magic users in Romancing SaGa 3 is that they don't have to use any weapon skills, so they can use their skill bank to remember defensive skills to cancel out enemy attacks instead. Another new feature are the field effects. Elemental spells and abilities have a chance of changing the elemental effect the combat screen is covered in. These effects will boost the power of abilities within the same element, while also having healing properties for enemies or party members with the right elemental armor. There are boss fights that use this to good effect, so you'll have ongoing fights for control over the field effects to stop the boss from passively undoing all the damage that you've done to them at the end of each turn. I quite like this. It's a lot like the weather effects in Pokemon, except it doesn't keep wasting your time with messages, animations, or barely contributing to the fights. It serves a real purpose without wasting your time, and it did this several years before Pokemon was even around as a franchise. Crafting is back from Romancing SaGa 2, and thankfully this time it's handled a lot better. In one of the central towns, there's a weapons shop where all the workers ran off. Once you drag them out of the pubs that they crawled into to drown their sorrows, you can start telling them to make equipment for you. Both the armor and weapon crafting sites can be active at the same time, and rather than randomly choosing one piece of armor or weapon for you to craft at a time, weapons and armor now show up in a list of things you can craft sequentially. The time it takes to craft items is still tied to how many combat encounters you fought, and since event rank is a lot looser than it used to be, focusing on crafting is a pretty easy task now. Also, crafting itself doesn't cost gold this time, though once you've crafted enough items for the first time, you can buy them for money and crafting materials in the shop upstairs. All in all, it's a much better system than the crafting in Romancing SaGa 2. Considering all this was happening before the Atelier series started the big crafting boom in JRPGs, it's very impressive what was done across 2 games here. And I touched on this before, but something that took some getting used to was how little things like battle rank or event rank mattered in this game. In Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song, combat encounters are what progresses your run, opening and closing quests based on your rank, so on replays for a full experience, you try to stay mindful of how many encounters you can fight, give or take, before starting certain quests. In Romancing SaGa 2, there's an event rank that controls when the next generation takes over, opening and closing quests along the way, and often powering up bosses based on how late into your playthrough you're fighting them. In Romancing SaGa 3, it's all cool. You can do you. There are some quests that do open up based on your max HP, but outside of that, I never noticed much pressure to avoid or seek out combat, nor was there pressure to do things now rather than later. There are quests that you can fail by waiting too long, but in this case, it's because they had to be done before other ones. And while I did fail a few quests on my first playthrough, most of the time I was doing the other quests, wondering if I was still allowed to go back and do the first one after. There's usually some logic to it, or at least a tangible connection. Monster rank is stuck to individual enemy sprites, so if you keep fighting bird sprites, you're going to fight stronger bird enemies over time, while the rest stays the same. With the stronger encounters, the pools of what enemies you fight change when initiating on the same map sprite, which also means you could technically lose out on potential drops that you need for crafting, but even that never felt like the biggest priority. As you fight increasingly stronger enemies, you grow increasingly strong. The rate at which your party improves at using weapons or casting spells depends on the strength of the enemies that you're fighting. The same goes for what abilities can spark. So you fight stronger enemies, you become stronger. There are a number of static fights during your run though. Static fights are usually the boss fights tied to quests, or just being able to get past an area for the first time. They'll always have the same stats no matter when you fight them, so it is possible to grind and overpower them in this game. Which is a bit of a shame, but in the end, with how freely you can run from combat and how you can build your party any way you want, you also have the freedom to control just how powerful you want to be before tackling any piece of content. Which might not mean too much the first time you're playing the game, outside of running into obstacles that are too strong for you and coming back later. But when you know what you're doing on a replay, you have a general feeling of when you should be able to take down what boss, since when it comes down to it, you can do most of the content whenever you want with a few minor limitations in place. There's 4 major dungeons and bosses that you're supposed to be making your way towards sooner or later, and during my replay I ended up moving towards them in reverse order compared to the first time. And even so, I already opened up the roads to the other ones before doing any of them. So it really is possible to tackle the main content at any time you feel up to the task. It is a game that gives you a lot of freedom, even compared to other entries in a series that's known to give you that. And it's a lot more forgiving than previous Saga games I've played for sure, which is nice because you never know what the game will hit you with next. There are some really odd potential allies, locations, and quests in Romancing SaGa 3, and the best part is that there's a number of quests that give you different choices in how you solve them. Like the war between 2 countries that are seemingly identical but just wearing different colors that both want you to join their cause and change the outcome for them. Or the fight for control over a town by 2 different groups of mages. The interesting thing I found on replays is that there's actually a bit more going on than just choosing if you're scub or anti-scub. In a lot of cases, one of the 2 choices you're faced with is also a lot harder. with stronger enemies or more complex strategies to them. Meaning that depending on if you do these quests sooner or later, or you just want more of a challenge or an easier time, you can tailor them to suit your playthrough when you know what you're doing. The mage towers are a good example of this. Team Magma has the harder fights if you choose to wipe them out, but if you ally with them, then Team Aqua is a lot easier to push around. Of course, you can go for the Emerald outcome by accepting both of their terms and double-crossing them, but I'm saving that for a later playthrough myself. Romancing SaGa 3 has a lot more character than previous entries, and a lot of that character wants to get noticed. Which is good, because this is a game where you can suplex a dragon, recruit a Boston Crab, or run away from a girl named after a candy because she keeps forcefully joining your party when she sees you in town. Or you can recruit a hunter who kinda resembles Slash. I mean, it's close enough. Just let him use a running slash. Yeah, perfect. One limitation that you have this time around is that instead of having 5 party members, you have 6 slots for them. 5 are for actual combat, and 1 is a spare slot. This doesn't mean that you can just fill up all 6 though. A lot of quests demand that you take someone with you until you complete the quest. Normally you remove the party members by talking to the barkeeper and telling him you want to remove someone from your party when you're in need of space. Sometimes though, you get these pesky characters who don't want to leave, but there's ways around this too. Nothing personal though. There's also a commander mode where if you place your own main character outside of the active combat group, you command the rest of the party with generalized orders, which is great if you love Final Fantasy XIII and would rather have the gameplay itself. But I'm not a big fan of it, or Final Fantasy XIII, so thankfully you don't have to touch this if you don't want to. It's there if you do, but it's fully optional. Speaking of fully optional, let's talk free real estate. There's a real estate minigame where you buy out companies and establish a monopoly in the name of good by throwing absurd amounts of money around. It's very similar to the one in Yakuza 0, but the incremental idle game aspect has been taken out of the equation. It's fun in a mindless sort of way, and as a piece of bonus content for Super Nintendo era JRPG, it's very impressive to even have here. But in a similar way, you have the war minigame, which, unless you're playing as Khalid, shows up in limited quantities in the main game. Neither of the times that you do it as other characters much is expected of you, so don't worry about having to learn it as anyone else. Personally, I couldn't find much enjoyment here, but the idea is okay. But I wish there was a bit more to it, or it had some better pacing to it, but it's optional, so I'm not going to complain too much about my personal distaste for it. And I haven't made mention of it, but you can probably already tell if you've seen the Romancing SaGa 2 review, or at least played it. This game looks a lot better than the previous game, and there's 2 reasons for that. The first one is that the original game itself always looked a lot better than its predecessor. Romancing SaGa 2 came out 1 year after Final Fantasy V, and Romancing SaGa 3 came out 1 year after Final Fantasy IV. Squaresoft came a long way graphically in 2 years' time, and it's as visible between the sprite work of Final Fantasy V and VI as it is Romancing SaGa 2 and 3. Besides this though, I'd say that the port in general is a lot better too. It's clear that with the success of Romancing SaGa 2's modern re-release, they've taken these new re-releases a lot more seriously. I'm quite fond of how this one came out in the end. It's still insane to me that these games got better treatment than the Final Fantasy entries on modern systems, since those have their roots on smartphones too. And as always, the music itself is godly. A lot of people praise Kenji Ito for his work on the Mana series, but I think his Saga work greatly outshines it. My only gripe with the soundtrack in this entry is that the character themes are the town themes. It doesn't quite hit as hard as the unique overworld themes of Minstrel Song, or the battle themes of Scarlet Grace. I get what they were going for, but outside of Katarina's theme, none of them really stuck with me. So, do I recommend Romancing SaGa 3? Yes, God yes. This is up there as one of the best Super Nintendo JRPGs in my book, and I really wonder what JRPG conversations would have been like back in the day if this had released properly in the West when it should have been. Playing the remaster, I forgot I was playing a Super Nintendo game at times, when very little was done to upgrade this game outside of the background art and text boxes. It's the easiest of the 3 Romancing SaGa games, 4 if you count Minstrel Song and the original version of 1 as their own game. And while I personally enjoy the extra pressure of event rank deadlines across a playthrough in Minstrel Song more, this is a great game in its own right, and the lower difficulty might be a good thing for people trying to find a starting point in the series. Also, while I did mention it, this is not a game that you have to replay to enjoy it. Even with just one playthrough, you'll get a solid 30 or so hours out of it as is. There's just a lot more reason to replay it than most JRPGs out there. Though I do have to give a bit of a warning to people looking to get into this game. There's a very well-known guide online for this game, and while the information that it provides through translating Japanese data mined information, a lot of what is written on there is terrible advice. If you're ever really lost and need to know how to finish a quest, by all means, use it, but maybe don't take what is written there as gospel, especially not in terms of the order to tackle content or the strategies to take with minigames and individual boss fights. Some of the takes in that guide are quite frankly baffling, and I myself bashed my head against a wall taking the wrong approach towards a few quests after looking up advice from it, and I've seen others do the same. Worse yet, at one point during the text for the final boss fight, the writer actively insults anyone playing the remaster as the only people who could possibly be struggling with this content. Normally, I wouldn't put anyone on full blast like this, but I can imagine new players see this wealth of information and think this guy knows his stuff. But with how I've seen him get in slap fights on the SaGa subreddit while I was looking for alternative information because his way is the true way in a game about freedom, yeah, don't follow that guy too closely. What you might want to follow closely though is this little manga that's out there called Romancing SaGa. It's a comedy manga set in a world quite like the Romancing SaGa games, following the exploits of background characters while the four heroes are off exploring the lands before stopping the ancient evil that is awakening. It has no involvement by Akitoshi Kawazu, but it is published by Square Enix, so it's official enough in that way. And it does capture the typical world and setting found in the series, showing us the smaller adventures of the average people you normally walk past in towns without a second thought. Not all of it is translated yet unfortunately, but there's enough to have a good time with right now for those interested. I highly recommend it. So anyway, this was AboveUp, and yeah, I actually intended to do a third playthrough of this game as Kali to experience the war minigame more. But the tastes that I got from it across my two playthroughs as Lucian and Katarina were more than enough for me really. I'll come back to this game to replay and experiment around with more in my own time in the future, since there's still plenty I feel like I have left to explore. But since my time away from video making started, I've beaten Minstrel Song with Gray, Albert, and Claudia, and did another Romancing SaGa 2 playthrough. So with 2 more Romancing SaGa 3 playthroughs, that means that I have done at least 7 SaGa playthroughs in the past year. It's a good time to take a break from this as is. So next video will be something different entirely. We're going to be having tea time. As always, this video was brought to you by people supporting me on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now, head over to patreon.com/aboveup and I will, see ya.
黒いマスクに素顔を隠し、神出鬼没の階段に街の悪事は誰が知る。天知る地知るロビン知る。黒いマスク黒いマント輝くあるの文字。悪人どもめかかってこい。クラエスクリュードライバー。さあみんな勇気を持つのだぞ。君たちの味方だぜ。いざか